Hello, everyone out in internet land. I'm used to seeing everyone in person, but for now, this will have to do. Welcome to the JCC Metro Detroit 2021 Lenore Marwell Detroit Jewish Film Festival. I'm Eric Lumberg, chair of the film festival. We are broadcasting live tonight, Monday night, May 3rd, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you. While you're here on our YouTube channel, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the reminder bell. That way you'll never miss any of our exciting events. The Detroit Jewish Film Festival celebrates the art of Jewish filmmaking by presenting films, encouraging discussion about Jewish stories, and creating shared experiences with filmmakers and audiences around the country and around the world. We also partner with organizations from around the community and around the country, which is how we are able to bring you this event tonight, presented in partnership with the Jewish Theological Seminary. Thank you for making this event possible. As hopefully you all know, the film festival this year runs until May 23rd. We have an exceptional lineup of films and, of course, live events planned. It is not too late to become a patron of Film Festival and get a Film Festival pass, giving you access to all of the films, exclusive content not available to others, and of course, these live events. We hope you'll consider supporting the festival and being part of all of the action. Please go to the website, culturalarts.jccdet.org/filmfest for more information on becoming a patron and all of the other events. For tonight's discussion, you can ask questions and offer comments in the YouTube comments section below or by texting the number in the corner of your screen. Our speakers will take as many of your questions as they can, but please be patient if your question isn't initially or immediately addressed. Before I invite Adina Barinholtz from the Jewish Theological Seminary to introduce our speakers, I want to, of course, extend my and our deepest gratitude to the whole Film Festival Committee. This has been a challenging year for all of us. Putting together this festival has been a labor of love, but also, of course, had a lot of challenges. The dedication, commitment, and hard work have made this exciting festival possible. And now, please welcome Adina Barinholtz.
Thank you, Eric. Good evening, and thank you all for joining us for tonight's enlightening program. I'm the local representative for the Jewish Theological Seminary, and I live and work in Metro Detroit. It is truly a great honor to introduce you to our speaker, Dr. David Kraemer, and moderator, Dr. Susan Adelman. David Kraemer is director of the Library of the Jewish Theological Seminary, home to one of the world's most outstanding collections of rare Judaica, including the world's second largest collection of fragments from the Cairo Geniza. Professor Kraemer is professor of Talmud and Rabbinics at JTS and a prolific author and commentator. His most recent book is A History of the Talmud, and his next book, to be published next year, will be A History of Jewish Ideologies of Diaspora. Dr. Susan Adelman is a retired pediatric surgeon and a past president of both the Wayne County Medical Society and the Michigan State Medical Society. She's also a past elected member of the AMA Board of Trustees. Susan is a writer of numerous articles, and she's currently in the process of writing her third book. Her most recent book, After Saturday Comes Sunday, is about the story of the last living people to speak Aramaic. Additionally, Susan is a talented artist who paints and makes jewelry. I especially want to acknowledge the JCC for giving us the opportunity to participate in tonight's program. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adina. And it's a great pleasure and an honor to be part of this program, especially with David Kraemer with his outstanding credentials. I was expecting that I had to introduce him, and I saw he's the author of 8 books and so forth. It's a long and illustrious history. So I don't know how many of you have had the opportunity to see the movie that we're discussing, but I thought perhaps in case you haven't seen it, I would share with you what this is. It's called From Cairo to the Cloud, The World of the Cairo Geniza. It was produced in 2018. The director and producer is Michelle Paymer, who's a member of the American Film Institute and of Phi Beta Kappa at UC Berkeley. What this talks about and presents very, very ably with beautiful visuals is a collection of ancient documents that were found in the Ben Ezra Synagogue in the old portion of Cairo, Egypt. Now, according to legend, and David might want to comment on whether he believes this, according to legend, tour guides, when we were there, the tour guide said that that's the site where Moses was found in the bulrushes. Okay, fine. Maybe. The building itself has been rebuilt several times. There have been fires and this sort of thing. But the original building may have been founded somewhere in the 1880s, in the 880s, I'm sorry, around 882. After being burned down, rebuilt, and so forth, it's accumulated documents from the 6th to the 19th century. Moses Maimonides lived nearby, and some of his writings are actually in the Geniza. So it's, I don't want to preempt what David's going to tell you, but it's an incredible repository of works, sacred and profane. And David also told me, and it's a good tip, to check the book Sacred Trash. And I read it, and it's a wonderful book. And for all of you who have additional interest in this subject, I strongly recommend that you get a copy of it. So I think that we ought to start right out with my asking David, what is a Geniza?
What a good question. So Susan, first of all, good evening. It's great to see you, and I'm really thrilled to be able to join you and the organizers of the event, but particularly everyone who's logged on in order to be able to participate in this event of the film festival. And it's really thrilling that a film like this has been included in the festival, because Ganesa is in the Jewish world a commonplace, and I'll explain what kind of commonplace it is in a moment, but the Cairo Geniza is really extraordinary. And so for those who knew little or nothing about it, or for those who had an introduction but just simply want to learn more, the film provides a great deal. I rewatched it earlier today and was reminded of how well it does its job. It's fascinating, actually, really fascinating. But in addition, this is one of the most important discoveries, Jewish certainly, but I would make an argument beyond that, most important historical discoveries of all time. And you may want to, follow up on that, Susan. But let me begin with a common Geniza. The word Geniza, as I'm sure some in our audience know, just simply means a storage place, a place where something is stored away or hidden away. In its normal usage, what it refers to is a place often, but not only, in a synagogue. We at the Library of the Jewish Theological Seminary have got a Geniza, for example, and it's for temporary storage of Jewish sacred writings that will be sent along to be buried. The proper treatment of sacred writings, according to Jewish practice, is that they be accorded the honor that one would accord a human body, a deceased person. And often, in fact, the practice is to take what might be a small Geniza and to bury a person with the remains found in the Geniza, and vice versa. Each honors the other. So that's a normal Geniza. And if you belong to a synagogue, in all probability, you will be able to ask about where you can find that Geniza. The Cairo Geniza is very different than what I just described. Would you like me to go ahead and remark upon its differences, Susan?
Absolutely. But I'm going to ask two questions before you do. One is, many of us who have heard of a Geniza, we're under the impression that the reason for a Geniza is to make sure that documents or books that have the name of God written are treated properly. Now, that would mean that what gets put in the Geniza has the name of God. However, in this case, in the Cairo Geniza, there are handwritten drafts, from Moses Maimonides, very important. There are pages from religious books. There are medical prescriptions, magic amulets, love letters, marriage contracts, business records, children's drawings. What's going on here?
So this is the difference between the Cairo Geniza and a normal Geniza. So a normal run-of-the-mill Geniza, it may be the name of God that defines the sacredness of the writing. It may be because it's a biblical book. Say the Book of Esther is part of the Hebrew Bible, but doesn't have the name of God in it. It may otherwise be grouped with sacred writings of Jews, and the community may see fit to put the work, therefore, in a Geniza. There will be different approaches to this, even if the strictest definition is the one you suggest, that it's got the name of God written in it. The Cairo Geniza is something altogether different. And it's distinguished by two very surprising qualities. The first actually is the one that you just outlined. Unlike a normal Geniza, the Cairo Geniza includes within it, or included within it, all kinds of writings, not just sacred writings, or maybe it's better that I say not just writings that, by one criteria or the other, the vast majority of Jews or Jewish communities would characterize as sacred. But it includes the kinds of things that you described. It's got contracts, it's got lists, it might be book lists, shopping lists, it's got letters, personal letters between a person and his or her business agent. I mean, we could multiply literally anything that represents the daily life of Jews and others in the medieval Mediterranean would be found in the Cairo Geniza. And the question is why, right? Why did it include such things when a normal Geniza wouldn't? We have to guess at the answer to that question, because there's no, written document that declares the answer. There's no written piece on the wall in the synagogue, and never was, why it is that these documents go in. So we have to make an educated guess. And in my mind, the best educated guess is that the people in this community, the Jews in this community, viewed Hebrew letters themselves, just the characters of the Hebrew language, as being sacred. Now, they may have derived their sacredness from the fact that Hebrew scripture was written in these characters. There were certainly mystical views amongst Jews, which offered mystical interpretations of the sacredness of these letters, and this goes back to ancient times. But one way or the other, they seem to have believed that anything written using Hebrew characters is sacred. The trick is that for Jews who lived in Cairo, they spoke Arabic, of course, because Jews in most places, the vast majority of places where Jews have made their homes, they've spoken the language of their broader home. In Italy, they spoke Italian. In Spain, they spoke Spanish when that was the language, or Arabic when it was under Muslim domination, and so forth, just as we speak English. But throughout history, Jews have written the local language using Hebrew characters. So the Arabic of Jews living in Cairo was written in Hebrew characters, But of course, their Arabic were these personal letters. They were these lists. They were these contracts, all of those many things that define a common life. Think of the many things that you might write. If it was written in these characters, it was put into the Geniza. There are a few exceptional texts which are also, well, it's more than a few, but the Arabic is another character. It's another form of writing that's found in the Geniza. But by and large, Arabic is in the Geniza because there's also Hebrew writing on the same document. Because these materials were expensive and rare, they reused writing materials. And so under most circumstances, we're talking about a palimpsest, or that is to say, where one document is written on top of another, or where on one side you'll have the Arabic and on the other side you'll have something written in Hebrew characters.
Yeah, that was going to be my question, because I know it was also written in Judeo-Arabic, which you just discussed, I believe in Aramaic, and so forth. Okay, now that's the overall view of the kinds of things that are in the Geniza. But there are some works by very important people, aren't there? Moses Maimonides, Judah Halevi, the Book of Ben Sira. Aren't those some of the highlight findings?
There are all kinds of things, yes. But before I get to that, I didn't explain why this Geniza survived, right? Why it wasn't sent for burial like a normal Geniza. So in order to appreciate this phenomenon, I think I have to answer that question as well, or do you want me to wait on it?
No, that's fine, because my next question was really going to be, how come all this stuff survived? How far back? Okay, we can do that then. How far back does it go? And how did all this stuff survive? Because there's been a fire, the synagogue's been rebuilt 3 times. We don't really know what happened when it was rebuilt. We don't know what happened to the repository that was in the Geniza in the meanwhile. So how did that all happen?
Yeah, so I mean, the fundamental reason it survived is because, for reasons that we do not know, and no one can ever know, this Geniza was never sent for burial. It was simply accumulated generation after generation after generation. We would say, thank God this was the case, right? Both thank God for its odd quality of including anything written in Hebrew characters, and thank God for never having been sent for burial, because it means this enormous discovery is available to us. But you also draw attention to the fact that there are always opportunities for things to be destroyed, right? For things to disappear. So how in the world did this survive? The answer is, of course, we don't know what may have been lost or destroyed over time, but the size of the discovery suggests that we preserve a very large portion of what was ever in this Geniza. We're talking, I mean, of course, these numbers are rounded, and it depends how you count. And much of the Geniza is fragmentary. So when we were asked at the Library of the Jewish Theological Seminary, what's the size of your Geniza collection? We're offering a number that actually counts the number of fragments we have. The same thing is true at the largest collection in the world, which is at Cambridge University in England. But whether it's our 43,000 fragments or their numbers keep changing. They're somewhere between 250,000 and 300,000. There are other collections elsewhere after theirs, and ours being the second largest collection. But the sheer size of that suggests that it was kept, that it didn't disappear. Beyond that, of course, if there were, say, fires or other events that destroyed some part of this collection, you would expect there to be chronological holes in the collection, right? And as the question you asked just a moment ago suggests about the famous people whose writings are preserved in this, the fact that we've got here actual writings from Maimonides, from the great philosopher and Hebrew poet Judah Halevi, So this is from the 11th, 12th century. This is from amongst the earliest levels of what was in the Geniza, and it didn't disappear. We've got abundant fragments from, say, Maimonides' family. So while there is no doubt that there are fragments that disappeared for various reasons, the bulk of the material seems to have survived.
So when you look up the dates of the materials in the Geniza, they say that the documents go from the 6th to the 19th century.
Yeah, I don't know what were you using as your source?
That was, I think that may have been Wikipedia.
Oh, okay. I don't know where 6th century comes from. Dating is a funny thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, just to be, kind of focus on it, manuscripts do not, of course, have title pages or copyright pages with the date of publication. We know when a manuscript was written either because there's a date in it, say a contract, or if there was a scribe who signed it with his name and indicated the date when the document was completed. But in the vast majority of cases of the Cairo Geniza, we've got to rely on the wisdom of people who know Hebrew writing very, very well and make very, very good educated guesses. But the fact that these are fragments means that the vast majority of the fragments have no clear indication of their date at all. We have to assume that if the synagogue was founded in the early, I'm sorry, I was going to say early 10th, late 9th century, late 800s, that the earliest writings come from that point. Of course, the date of the documents when they were formulated might be much older. The Hebrew Bible, of course, goes back many, many centuries, but we're asking the date of the actual copies. And so it's fair to say that the height of the synagogue and the community, and therefore the large majority of the materials found in the Geniza, comes from the 10th till the 13th century. This is when we've really got riches telling us about the community and its life.
Yeah, the point that was made in the article that I read is that the synagogue may or may not have been built somewhere around 882 or after, but that there were at least 150 years worth of documents or books or whatever that got thrown into the Geniza eventually once it was built. And then you don't know what the provenance was of those things and so forth. I mean, the book Sacred Trash made a big deal out of some pages from the book of Ben Sira, which would be something very obscure to most of our audience. But apparently, when the scholars originally saw that was like the most phenomenal finding. They were incredibly excited.
That
was much older.
Yes, that was the eureka moment. Ben Sira. As a document, it goes back many, many centuries before the Geniza. What's surprising about it is that it shows up in the Geniza in its original Hebrew. Just to give a few details quickly, Ben Sira was a Jewish sage who lived in Jerusalem in the first half of the 2nd century before the Common Era. Temple was standing. He actually names in his writing the high priest of his time, and he wrote a book of wisdom that in many significant respects is very similar to the biblical book of Proverbs. It's a piece of wisdom, and it's a very, very fine book. There's no doubt that it's Jewish from beginning to end, but it wasn't included in the official Jewish biblical canon because it was too late for that. The Hebrew Bible only includes works that at least get away with the fiction that they were written before the end of the Persian period. They may actually be later, but they got away with it. The book of Ben Sira tells us, and it was translated into Greek by Ben Sira's grandson. So we know when it was actually written, and it was therefore too late for inclusion. But what was significant about it, and the reason Solomon Schechter got so excited about it, is because it was known as an ancient work, and even though it's not included in the Hebrew Bible, it's quoted by the rabbis of the Talmudic period as scripture. In other words, you could quote the book of Proverbs, or on, several occasions, they quote from the book of Ben Sira as though it were scripture, even though as Bible, it's included only in the Catholic Apocrypha. If you get a Catholic Bible, in the Apocrypha section, you'll be able to find the book of Ben Sira. There was a debate about its first language. Was it written in Hebrew, as the time and place of its origin would suggest? Was it perhaps formulated first in Greek, because Greek was one of the standard languages in the land of Israel in 2nd century BCE, in Jerusalem? I mean, Greek was all over the place. So when the original Hebrew, Solomon Schechter knew of the quotations in Hebrew in the Talmud and other pieces of rabbinic literature. But when this was brought and it became clear to him that this was actually the original Hebrew text of Ben Sira, he knew that he had his scholarly career made, even though he was already well established. I mean, this was the way to become famous amongst university professors and others.
So the the movie goes into the matter of how this was discovered. In the book Sacred Trash, certainly emphasizes how this was discovered and how the Ganesa itself was discovered. Would you like to tell the audience a bit about how this Ganesa was discovered and by whom?
I'll be happy to, sure. Discovery is a funny word here because it was known, right? But it was discovered, shall we say, by the West at a particular point, and that's what led to its recovery from Egypt and to the massive project of interpreting it ever since. So there were folks who traveled through Cairo who had interest in Jewish antiquities and knew of this old synagogue and came close from time to time. One way or the other, there were local dealers who got their hands on fragments and were able to sell them. There was a Russian Karaite. Karaites are Jews who reject rabbinic authority and claim to be living according to the Bible alone. And there was a Karaite in the mid-19th century, Russian, who thought he could prove the correctness of Karaitic Judaism by finding original documents. And so he actually made his way and was able to obtain some documents from the Cairo Geniza. But its real discovery came at an interesting point. I mean, just to give a little bit of background here, when the printing press was invented, it was the new technology and people ceased to pay attention to manuscripts. Who cares about manuscripts, particularly if you think about it, manuscripts that have been thrown into a storage room as scraps in a synagogue in Old Cairo. I mean, so, who needs these materials? But it began to emerge as scholarship became more sophisticated in the mid-19th century, that there was a lot that could be recovered. And so Jews and others began traveling the world looking for manuscripts that survived. And one of those travelers was the brother of the then chief rabbi of the British Empire. The brother, his name was Elkin Nathan Adler. And he actually came to Cairo and very close to the Geniza in 1889, shortly before the synagogue was razed for its reconstruction project. And that's kind of a notorious chapter in Cairo Geniza history and studies. But then in 1896, Elkin Nathan Adler came back. He made it there several months before Solomon Schechter did. And he was able to obtain what we now know to be roughly 43,000 fragments that he stuffed in a large Torah cover and was able to bring home with him. It became part of his personal collection. And he was, as I say, collecting manuscripts. After the Ben Sira fragment was brought to Solomon Schechter, Schechter sought and obtained the money to be able to recover the Geniza as a whole, meaning what was still there, the Geniza, which was the most substantial part of it. And he went to Cairo. He managed to acquire the collection, and it was all brought back to Cambridge, where the largest part of the collection has been ever since. And Cambridge has got, and you'll see this in the film, if you've seen the film already, or if you see it after this, they've got a magnificent center for Ganesa research, and the materials are very well organized and presented. But it took a long time. The famous picture of Solomon Schechter sitting over piles and piles of fragments, filthy, dusty, that's in a room he had at the Cambridge University Library, and it's a classic.
I remember. I've seen I saw the synagogue before the renovations in the 90s, when it was absolutely filthy and a total mess, and then I saw it afterwards. But in the book Sacred Trash, there's a wonderful little anecdote about two major European scholars, one at Oxford and one at Cambridge, and the one at Cambridge said. But they had a friendly, or not so friendly, maybe rivalry. And the one at Cambridge wrote his counterpart at Oxford and said, I have just found a page from the book of Sirach. And normally his counterpart would write him right away. 2 weeks passed. Finally, after 2 weeks, his counterpart at Oxford said, I've just found 4 pages of the book of Sirach.
Right. But it's important to say, it's interesting. There was all kinds of I would call it romantic stories about the discovery of the Geniza. But it's important to emphasize that we have no idea what would have happened if, say, Solomon Schechter had gotten there in 1888 as opposed to 1896. Because in 1889, they destroyed the synagogue. They took it down in order to rebuild it according to some imagination of what it was, according to the same plan, allegedly. And the Geniza, which had been in the Ganesa storage room of the old synagogue, was simply laid out in the courtyard, right? So we have no idea what blew away, what was stolen, what otherwise disappeared. As importantly, we have no idea what kind of damage was done to these materials as they were dumped out into the yard and then thrown back into the storage room of the newly rebuilt synagogue. And then with each additional visitor, Elkin Nathan Adler, Solomon Schechter, jumping through the hole, the entrance into the Geniza, into this vast pile of centuries old, filthy materials. But of course, every time they jumped down into it and stepped on it, they were destroying materials, right? What was used to be one fragment now became 2 or 3 or 4 fragments. So the whole venture may have been much easier if someone had gotten there before the reconstruction project.
Well, I don't know what it looked like, of course, in the 1800s, but when I saw it, the hole was not very big. It was up high, and it wasn't at floor level. So you couldn't just step into it. You would have to literally climb up and jump down. So God only knows. So now, how did the material that did get to the JTS, how did it get there?
The key is the fellow that I've emphasized up to this point, Elkin Nathan Adler. Even though those who know the Jewish Theological Seminary associated with Solomon Schechter. And in fact, in Israel, the branches of the seminary in Israel are conventionally known as the Schechter Seminar, right? Because the name Schechter is very closely connected. He was the first president of the reconstituted Jewish Theological Seminary in the early 20th century. But the fact is that our collection overwhelmingly is from Elkin Nathan Adler. In the early 1920s, Elkin Nathan Adler's private collection, magnificent collection of Hebrew manuscript, including his Ganesa collection, was up for sale, and there was competition over this. And supporters of JTS made our case and offered our amount. And in 1923, we became the owners of Elkin Nathan Adler's collection, and included in that were this Ganesa collection, and they've been ours ever since. As far as Solomon Schechter is concerned, Cambridge owned the Geniza, not Schechter didn't. And so when Schechter left Cambridge to come to New York to be president of the Jewish Theological Seminary, he was allowed to take the documents from the Geniza that he was actively working on at the time. Now, those are amazing documents, right? I mean, obviously, if Solomon Schechter is going to select them for his own scholarship, you're talking about something very serious. But we're only talking about 50 items, not more than that.
I see that there are some proponents of two women who we haven't talked about. So somebody, quite a few people, I think, have read the books and want to know what we can tell about the two sisters who played an important role in finding the Ganesa.
They did indeed. Margaret Gibson and Agnes Lewis. I mean, there's actually a wonderful description of their travels in the movie, as there is in Sacred Trash. So whichever source you want, for more details, I recommend it to you. The film does a nice job on them. But they were included in this population of individuals who recognized the value of documents, ancient documents that could be recovered. They're actually most famous, not in the Jewish world, but in the world as a whole, for having recovered documents from the library at the monastery of St. Catherine at Mount Sinai. There are amongst the earliest Christian writings that survive from the collection, from the library there, including including apocryphal writings that, when they were first discovered, and in an ongoing way, I should say, actually raised a lot of eyebrows, because they tell things about at least some authors' imaginations of the life of Jesus that are quite unexpected. So there was controversy about that discovery. They also went to Cairo, and they bought fragments in the market in Cairo. One of the fragments was this fragment of Ben Sira, which, when they came back to Cambridge, they were very, very well educated. They were linguists. They had the classical Semitic languages behind them, Hebrew and so forth, but they didn't recognize the document. And so that's why they invited Solomon Schechter to see this, and that was the source of his eureka moment.
So now there are fragments from the Geniza in Cambridge, in Oxford, at the JTS, in Vienna, in Moscow, in private collections. Tell us about how much of this has been digitalized and how accessible it is and who can access it.
So the short answer is a very easy and short answer, but I'm going to expand on the short answer a little bit. The answer is that virtually the entirety of the Ganesa collection has been digitized thanks to a gentleman named Albert Friedberg, who was not an academic, is not an academic himself, but was interested at a Jewish academic conference, became interested in the Geniza, and he had significant resources and decided to support the digitization of everything from the Ganesa that he possibly could. So the Friedberg Ganesa Project, now Ganesa.org, is essentially complete. Anyone, you have to register to go to their site because they want to keep a record of who does research, and if you're doing research, they want to they want you to promise to donate back the discoveries that you make in order to enrich the field of Ganesa studies. But anyone can do it, so, the short answer is it's all available. It's easily available. You can do it from anywhere in the world. And I could end my answer there, but I do want to add that this project began with smaller collections, which were in process. But this is a vast collection. And early on in the digital revolution, nobody had imagined digitizing collections of this size, particularly rare collections, because you need special treatment, you need climate control, all the things that we require in order to protect materials of this sort. And so the time that it would take for the care of the photography, everyone imagined would be immense and the cost therefore prohibitive. The people at the project were convinced that they could do it more efficiently. They came to us. I was early on in my tenure as director of the library at JTS. I've been doing that for nearly 18 years ago. It wasn't quite 18 years ago, but already this is a long established project. And we were the first large collection they approached. And I said, yeah, we're all ears. So we'd love to be able to do this. And we were lucky that our collection was stored in such a way, in clear Mylar envelopes, right? Sealed in these clear Mylar envelopes, that actually made the photography a great deal easier. Because they were protected. So if we just simply unbound them from these notebooks, the photographer would feed them in and do one after another after another. Over time, we used 2 photographers, but for the 43,000 items, it took maybe 8 months, right? People imagined it would take years and years. And as a result, we were able to contribute the images of our collection and prove that it could be done at large scale. And I believe it's accurate to say that thanks to our success, the Friedberg Project was able to go back to Cambridge, whom they had approached before, and say, we can do it, and this is the proof of it. And as a result, it's all been done.
So let's say somebody is really, really good at jigsaw puzzles, and they want to look at this digitized material, and they want to see if a half a page from your collection just happens to fit a half a page from a collection in Moscow, and so forth, going back and forth and back and forth. Can anybody do that, or do you have to have a PhD in something?
Well, you don't need a PhD at all, at least for the first steps, because thanks to the computer geniuses at the Ganesa Project, the first major suggestions of a match can be done by computer. They will examine the edges of fragments. They will examine the handwriting on the fragments and suggest joins. And they've been relatively successful on those joins. Hundreds have been made since this programming has been put into place. Before that, it was much, much harder. And one of the signs of a great Ganesa scholar would be someone who remembered the shape of the edge of the jigsaw puzzle and remembered the handwriting and also had some sense of its substance and was able to put it together. I've got to say that a friend and colleague of mine, professor of Ganesa studies at Princeton University, Marina Rustow, cooperated with others to create a gaming program, to use gaming technology, believe it or not, to do preliminary sorts of Ganesa materials. Because if there's large formal writing, then you can pretty well guess that it's a certain kind of text. If there's large Arabic writing separated by space between the lines, if there's cribbed, what looks like, the way a doctor's handwriting would, Maimonides, then you can make a different kind of guess. That's right. There you go. But you don't even need to read Hebrew or Arabic in order to do that. You just need to be able to identify certain glaring features. And so technology has contributed greatly to the organization of these collections and helped scholars who then will be able to more quickly find the kind of material that they're interested in.
So somebody writes in, please ask about the connections, if any, between the Geniza and the Dead Sea Scrolls.
The short answer and the long answer is that there's one connection, but only one. The Dead Sea Scrolls, of course. Someone in the movie actually references the possibility that the Dead Sea Scrolls were also a Geniza. Most Dead Sea Scroll scholars would not support that notion. It was a library, not a Geniza. But that being said, the Dead Sea Scrolls that collection was far smaller than the Cairo Geniza. We're talking about 800 documents amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls. As I said, we're talking about more than 250,000, 300,000, 400,000. Some people quote 500,000 for the Cairo Geniza. I mean, it's a radically different order of magnitude, and the nature of what's preserved in it. What's in the Dead Sea Scrolls is genuinely sacred writings, because it is the writings of some group or groups who very consciously preserved these texts for their sacred quality. But, and this is very important, one of the Dead Sea Scrolls was known already in the 19th century, decades before the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1948 and into the 50s, and then the later discoveries later on. One of the most sectarian scrolls of all showed up in the Cairo Geniza, and it was a great mystery because no one could figure out what did this represent. And so there were writings. A professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary, Louis Ginsberg, wrote a major work on this. Salman Schechter actually dealt with it, others as well. They imagined that this was some strange sect. Some people suggested that this was even a fiction, an invention from some time in the Middle Ages that found its way into the Cairo Geniza. What we now know is that from the period before the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, when the library near Qumran was being collected, one of its most sectarian documents, it's known by scholars amongst other names as the Damascus Covenant, was preserved by Jews over the centuries, and it showed up in the Cairo Geniza. Its quality was only appreciated when the Dead Sea Scrolls were finally discovered in the late 1940s.
Wow. So what are some of the things that we've learned about life in Cairo hundreds and hundreds of years ago by looking at the material in the Geniza?
Great question. I would say, three outstanding things, one very broad and two a little bit more specific. And of course, anybody who's familiar with this vast collection will have a different answer to the question. So the first, and I think many Qumran, I keep on going back to the Dead Sea Scrolls, many Ganesa scholars would answer, at least amongst their top three, by saying we learn how much the Jewish community lived with, among, and like its neighbors. What is striking in document after document, not the religious documents as such, because they preserve another time and place, but the documents that tell us about real life. Jews are living with and like their neighbors. So when I'm introducing this collection to people, I often say, not only is this arguably the most important discovery of all time with respect to Jewish history, but even for Arab Muslim history of the Middle Ages, because we do learn so much about the way Arab Muslims lived during this time in the Eastern Mediterranean as well. So Jews and their neighbors, I think, would be my first answer. The second two are a little bit more specific and curious and interesting. It's always fascinating to see how human humans are, right? Interpersonal relations. So what humans do, they've always done. We find letters written to Maimonides' son in this collection. One specific example that I love, a woman who met a Jewish man when he was traveling in Rome, and she was still a Christian, and they fell in love. And she came with him to Cairo, where she bore a child. And then he decided that he was a little bit tired of her. And so he took up with a Muslim woman on the other side of town. And she writes to Maimonides' son that she's now without any support and she needs the support of the community. I mean, there's so many ways that a story like that is resonant with what we all know to be real life. And there are many, many examples, many of them not quite so scandalous, but you get the general idea. The other thing I love is the evidence of Jews traveling. Jews traveled a lot in the Middle Ages, and there's evidence, very ample evidence of that in the Cairo Geniza. We are constantly taught that, in the olden days, Jews stayed near the shtetl in which they were born, and in their whole life, they never went more than X amount of miles, whatever that was. I won't judge the Jews of the shtetl, but the Cairo Geniza teaches unambiguously that travel is something that Jews and others love to do. The only difference was that you couldn't phone home when you were far away. You might be away months or years, and your family wouldn't know whether you survived. They would discover, if God willing, you would return later on and become part of the community again.
Well, it's the book that I'm just finishing right now talks about connections between Israel and the Holy Land and India. And of course, it says in the Bible that King Solomon sent ships to Ophir, which is believed to be India, and got peacocks and various things for building the temple and so forth. And from what I've read, it looks like there are records of some of these trade documents and documentation that it's indeed true that Jews were traders going back and forth from Egypt to India, and then of course from the Silk Route on to China. And that's, I mean, how many places do you have that kind of Hamish documentation of a letter saying I just got cheated when I wanted to buy 3 measures of something and they gave me 2.5.
Right. It's actually interesting. S.D. Goitein, Shlomo Dov Goitein, who was the first scholar to deal with this massive collection as a whole and realize its promise for telling us about everyday life. One of the first things he was interested in and he wrote about was the trade routes, and Jews involved in trade in precisely the way that you describe.
Someone just asked, I know the answer is rather sad. She asked about the Jewish community in Egypt today. Let me soften that question a little bit and ask about how big was the Jewish community in Cairo. I can't really say over 900 years, but over in the period of time when the Ganesa was accumulated. And then, of course, I pretty much know the answer, what the Jewish community is like in Egypt today.
Yeah. So I'm going to answer. I mean, I don't know the answer, but nobody else does either. Really, of course, all of these are educated guesses. And when we look at numbers from earlier times, our expectations have to be very, very different. So a large city in the Middle Ages was 10,000, 20,000 people. Jews lived in what came to be known as Old Cairo, Fostat, and then Cairo was actually founded as a royal city near Fustat, and Fustat was absorbed into Cairo. It's not a large area. It's a medieval city. So are we talking about a few thousand Jews at most? I mean, this is an educated guess. Maybe I invite anyone to correct me on this, but certainly in order of magnitude, I'm in the right ballpark. Did you want to answer about the Jewish community today?
There's not much to say. There's not much community. Let me go back to Maimonides. So how come Moses Maimonides happened to be in the neighborhood?
Why did he happen to be in the neighborhood? Because it was the center of the world, and as as somebody says in the film, if you could, I think it's actually Marina Rustow, if you could be in Cairo, why wouldn't you be? Right? It's sort of like later on, when Jews were forced to leave their homes in the Russian Empire in the late 19th and early 20th century. Where did you go? You went to New York. I mean, where else would you go? So Cairo was a great attraction. Maimonides, this is elided by whoever makes the comment in the film. I was a little bit disappointed about this because whoever says this is, Maimonides was born in Spain and found his way to Cairo, and that's true. But Maimonides was born in Cordoba in Spain, forced to flee with his family because there was a change of Muslim regimes, and the new regime was very intolerant. And as some of our viewers may know, they actually fled to North Africa, precisely to the center of where this regime was located. And there's all kinds of speculation. This was from, if I'm remembering the years correctly, Maimonides' latter teens and through his 20s. And there's speculation that, at least publicly, Maimonides and his family had to masquerade as Muslims because everyone has a hard time figuring out how they could have gotten away with being Jews publicly. There's even some speculation that Maimonides converted to Islam, whatever that would mean. Obviously didn't, that wasn't fundamental to his long-term identity. But finally, after some years there, Maimonides left and, headed east, spent a very, very brief period of time in Crusader Palestine, simply to visit the holy sites, spent a couple of days in Jerusalem, I mean, literally a couple of days, and made his way to Cairo. And he was received in Cairo as a celebrity because already by that point, he was still quite young, he was recognized as one of the great geniuses of Jewish law for many generations. And though very young, was immediately invited to become the chief rabbi of the community, which an office in which he served for, a brief period of time before he said, what, enough of this. And he devoted himself to his scholarship. He then served later, again, as chief rabbi. Back to the traders, his brother actually traded for him. It was thanks to his brother's risking his life and ultimately losing his life trading to India that Maimonides was able to be supported in his scholarship. But he spent most of his life in Cairo. It's funny that we associate Maimonides with Spain because though that's where his early education was, he was a man of Cairo.
So in the JTS collection, do you have any specimens of his handwriting?
We do. We've got some great selections, as they do elsewhere. Cambridge has got a great collection. We've got a wonderful letter where Maimonides, as chief executive officer, aka chief rabbi of the community, signs a form letter. Would have been written in multiple copies by a scribe, but he signs his name to it, asking that Jewish communities pay the pledges they have made to help redeem Jews who have been taken captive by the Crusader forces.
Oh,
So this is a very serious piece, but we've got his, his signature, which is, there are multiple copies in the Ganesa, but very, very easy to identify and familiar. We also got some important writings where he, for example, some first drafts or early drafts of his great legal work, the Mishneh Torah, or of his philosophical work, Guide for the Perplexed. It's extraordinary that we've got literally the earliest form of those writings in our collection, and other collections, Cambridge in particular has as well.
so if somebody wants to actually see those, not digitized, but see them, the real thing, is it possible to come to the JTS library and see that sort of thing?
It is, but you've got to wait a little bit. So first of all, let me say it makes a big difference if you see them in person. There's something about, face-to-face or face-to-page that, I mean, the way to think about it is, imagine the difference between seeing a screen image of the Mona Lisa and then, waiting in that long line at the Louvre, but getting a chance to see it face to face. It does make a difference. If you've got Maimonides' signature in front of you, it's like you're in his presence. It's just thrilling, right? Your blood, you can feel it flowing in ways that it doesn't otherwise. Unfortunately, we are still involved in our construction project. The construction is done, but the project is not yet. We are finalizing our climate control, and we have not moved our rare collection back to JTS therefore yet. Our hope and expectation is that we will be able to open to the public sometime in the fall. And so not only to the person who asked this question, but to anybody else as well. If, check on our website to make sure we've opened, but if we are open, get in touch with me and let me know that you're coming to New York City, and I will be happy to show you this or other Ganesa materials in person.
We have an answer on the Jewish population in Egypt, at least before 1948. Which was 70 to 75,000.
Okay, makes sense.
So that's there you go.
But I was answering for Fustat, for medieval Cairo.
Yeah. Fustat, well, that's okay. Fustat is still quite a place to visit, and it's in the very center. So what else? I guess the only other thing I might ask is, are there any other Ganesas that we know of that have historic material, anything like what's in the Cairo Geniza?
So in the proper sense, no. Using the term a little bit more broadly, there were Ganezas that were discovered out of the US wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. With some materials. I don't know very much about them, but they're much more recent, at least according to the reports with which I'm familiar. If I'm corrected, that would be great. It'd be interesting if there were more ancient materials. The other place where the term Ganesa is used, and this is actually very important, when the printing press was invented, I mentioned this, I think, earlier, manuscripts were no longer valued in the same way. And so the materials of manuscripts, often manuscripts, particularly of religious writings, were written on vellum or parchment. And parchment is a very, very strong material. So printers, or actually bookbinders, use this material to reinforce the bindings of newly printed books or of other such documents. So there are scholars, and there's one scholar in particular who's been going through old municipal libraries in Italy. And Italy was the first place where print exploded. And going through shelves in old municipal libraries, looking for Hebrew manuscripts that are preserved inside the bindings of 16th century books. And he's found hundreds and hundreds of fragments What's wonderful about them is that unlike the Cairo Geniza, they were very well protected. No one ever stepped on them. They were cut, first to form the, for the binding. But once they were inside, they were protected from the elements, and they are easily readable to this day. They're a very important source for new discoveries.
Wow, that would really be exciting.
Yeah.
I think we have run out of questions from our audience. It's been a great pleasure. I think we've all learned a great deal. I certainly have. And I would like to thank you very, very much for sharing your expertise. I know you could go on for another hour or two, and I certainly could too, but I'm not sure if the system would. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you everybody who joined us.
Adina?
Yes, thank you. Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, David and Susan. It was a pleasure listening to you. And please take a moment to visit the Film Festival website. It's on the screen. And you can join us tomorrow evening, Tuesday, May 4th, for discussion of the Vigil and a legitimately Jewish horror film. And also, I want to invite you, anyone who wants to come see the Ganesa fragments at JTS this fall, please feel free to contact me or David Kraemer. We will be happy to help set that up for you. And thank you.